recorded in the beautiful mountains of British Columbia. Welcome to
Friends on Horses. Welcome back to Friends on Horses. This is our second round with Nina Ekholm Fry, who works with therapeutic human-horse interactions and equine behavior and welfare as Director of Equine Programs at the University of Denver's Institute for Human-Animal Connection. She is a trauma therapist and leads the Postmaster Program in Equine-Assisted Mental Health for therapists who want to include interactions with horses in psychotherapy. Welcome back, Nina.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Hi, Mira. Hi, Emma.
From our last podcast, I think we even noted at the end, it felt like we were just scratching the surface of just the wealth of knowledge that you have in this field. And I'm so excited to just touch on today specifically just the horse-human connection and how that's been brought into therapy. So I guess a good place to start maybe, something that I'm curious about is there a lot of research about this topic out there?
So if we're talking about human-horse interactions and including them in some sort of professional human service, it could be education, special education, kind of academic related things. It could be in life coaching. It can be in healing work or other ways of supporting human health and wellness. Or it could be in healthcare, where we have restricted professions, folks with registrations and licenses who provide treatment to others. That could be occupational therapy or physical therapy, speech language therapy, or psychotherapy, which is my area. As you can hear, there's kind of a plethora of things going on, and that's me leaving out riding instruction. So adaptive riding instruction, sometimes called therapeutic riding, but it can get a little confusing because the therapeutic there doesn't refer to treatment or health care. It refers to adapting access to horses through riding instruction, horsemanship instruction, so that folks with disabilities don't experience barriers in getting to be with horses, where perhaps a typical setting might not be able to accommodate and might not be supportive enough for that enjoyment. So as you can hear now, there's a multitude of things going on when it comes to horses and humans for the human's health and benefit. So when we're talking about research in this area, that is a little bit of a barrier, really understanding what is it we're talking about? How are we conceptualizing the service? Because outside of instruction, riding instruction, and recreating together with horses or providing opportunities to be with horses in that kind of realm, outside of that, we really have to look at what is the professional service offered. Is it psychotherapy? Is it coaching? What is it? And that's been confusing because sometimes human-horse interactions in this realm of kind of human services has been conceptualized as an alternative to a service, like an alternative to physical therapy or alternative to psychotherapy. And that's led internationally to a lot of difficulties assessing research or comparing research, doing analyses on a bunch of research studies to see themes. So unfortunately, that's been kind of a barrier to really understanding more, but I feel we're getting closer now through a few terminology efforts here in North America and some kind of conceptual papers coming out on how to perhaps think about the service in question so that we can then research it and then look at what are these specific effects of including horses versus doing the same service but not including horses. So it's a great question, and it's a difficult topic to discuss because the research quality hasn't been that great over the past 20, 30 years. But again, I have hope.
That's a great answer. I can imagine how complicated that would be to research and how much you would have to kind of be very specific and have to have a system in place to own in order to get what you would feel like were accurate results, you know?
That's right. Yeah, because if we're conducting the kind of research that we call quantitative, or where we're trying to have a representative area of people and an intervention that we research that could then say something about broader or situations in other places than that particular state or city or whatnot. If we're doing a quantitative approach, what we typically might do is do a comparison between one thing and the other, and then look at the difference, and call that the effect. And the problem is that we've had some quantitative research. On the other side, qualitative research helps us understand more about what we're researching. It's a very valuable approach. Sometimes it's kind of positioned as less than quantitative, but it's not actually true, because there's multiple ways to look at gathering information. But in the quantitative realm, again, the issue has been then when we have a comparison, and typically you have what's called a control of some sort, where somebody is living their lives continuously, and you're kind of comparing to make sure that the change that occurred is not just a factor of a human living their life kind of thing.
Right.
And in psychotherapy research, we know basically almost 100% for certain that an intervention, a kind of psychotherapy, is better than none. So we don't have to be concerned about is psychotherapy as a thing better than not having psychotherapy. But instead, we might again compare with that third group, a control that has life or treatment as usual. But the problem is then if we're comparing, say, a group intervention using a fairly common therapy approach called cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's certain principles that the therapist follows when they conceptualize treatment and content of treatment, while they of course tailor to the individual, or the setting if it's a group. But the issue is we've then compared cognitive behavioral therapy group with something that people have called equine-assisted therapy. And when I hear that, and it could just as well be animal-assisted therapy, and when I hear that, I have no idea what that is. I don't know what kind of therapist it is. I can't tell what the service is, because it's not its own service, to include animals in a service, So it's been, again, that's an example of this misconception that instead of comparing, so to speak, CBT group with an equine-assisted, again, some difficulties with that definition, group, and then sort of trying to do a comparison of those differences, which there's so many variables, kind of, Emma, that you were alluding to, instead doing a group with CBT, with a CBT approach, and then doing the exact same thing, but including interactions with horses as part of the treatment arc to bring experiential features to it, so some doing in the therapy setting, to bring additional relational experiences and features, to bring additional aspects of somatic or mind-body engagement, such as touch and movement, to simply enhance what it is we're doing as restricted, licensed, or registered professionals, making use of our practice standards, making use of evidence from research or research-informed practices, as well as the client's own preferences and needs. So that's really, if we understand that way of conceptualizing things, specifically within healthcare or these restricted professions, it then becomes perhaps a little easier just for anybody to wrap their mind around, what's this deal with animals in therapy? How should I think about that? Is that something I should do instead of, or as part of, or that kind of thing?
It's really, oh, sorry, Emma.
Oh man, you go for it.
It's really interesting because, even as you're talking, I'm sure we can all kind of picture what a typical quote unquote counseling session looks like, or psychotherapy session. It's, you know, you can kind of conjure it up in your mind. I'm sure we've all seen it on TV. But even just visualizing what psychotherapy looks like with a horse, and let alone bringing in that relational piece, because of course that takes time. I'm wondering if you can describe for us what a typical session would look like.
Sure. So again, if we're talking about psychotherapy, we know that treatment happens through what's sometimes defined as definitive psychological communication, meaning that the therapist here, the psychotherapist, uses ways to think about human health and change in their verbal and also kind of bodily interaction with a client. Direct touch is not typically part. There's some body work methods where a psychotherapist may train specifically in that. But when I'm talking about things like the body and the body mind, I'm generally talking more about the therapist's capacity to track the client's state, especially relative to their autonomic nervous system. You know, is the client starting to get a little tenser? Are they starting to move away a little? Are they starting to blink more rapidly? And it's also about the therapist being able to not only, of course, attune to the person they're with so that they can create a space to again, dialogue that's not an assault on their nervous system, but also to be able to track the same in oneself. So that's the basic premise of psychotherapy is more or less that you have the opportunity to be in exchange with a person, another human, and the other human, the therapist, may hold therapeutic intentions aligned with the client's goals, with the client who the client typically provides or we work together on, in three broad areas: in so-called insight related things, like helping a client make connections between things in their lives so that life doesn't feel so random, and that there feels like there's sort of some meaning making that's possible, that life doesn't just happen to you and it's all these fragmented pieces and you don't know how you got where you got, kind of thing, which is of course a feeling we all have from time to time. That's also typical. Or so insight related things, which was the kind of traditional psychoanalytic approach, or part of that area anyway. Skill-based, like building skills relative to your own mind and body, relative to interpersonal interactions. And finally, which is especially for trauma therapists, a focus, and body-related therapists, to think about the client's state. So the combination of their body and their thoughts and their mind to provide opportunities for the client to perhaps have a moment of calm in their body and mind that week, that one time, or a sense of curiosity, a sense of hope, or ability to future see. Because if we don't have the ability to imagine ourselves in the future, it kind of impairs one of the main features of therapy, which is hope. You know, the feeling that things can be different. So again, based on those very broad principles, then therapists work in various ways, more cognitively, behaviorally, perhaps with a basis of neurobiology and the body leading, such as in some of the trauma treatment approaches. It can be simply based on kind of a strength-based or short-term approach. It's a number of ways that the therapist approaches things. But typically, we sit, and in fact, this could be a telehealth kind of situation here where we're looking at each other through a screen and we are interacting in this way. So when we then imagine including another animal, most animals other than horses and larger animals who don't live in our environments immediately, they can come into the office space. So the setting looks similar, as in the room looks similar, but there is all of a sudden opportunity for movement within the typical room that might not feel natural or might not occur. You might not just sit on the floor without having a small dog that you're interacting with in a typical therapy session. But when we include horse interactions, we also change the parameters of the setting of therapy to include nature, visible access perhaps to other animals than horses, perhaps wildlife. We have more flexibility in the environment, but also the opportunity for structure. It's not just, oh, well, where should we walk around now? You know, we can still have that same, you know, we meet here, we sit down, we check in, and then we may use the therapy time for some movement. We might simply observe animals or horses while interacting and engaging, while seated. We can even be on top of a horse mounted while the service remains psychotherapy. So, you know, it's really the way to think about it is to take the elements, some of those elements that are possible in that kind of, you know, temporary in a way, 60 minutes, 45 minutes, human horse interaction that takes place in that session. And then for the therapist to think, how can I enhance, how can I better what I'm already doing by bringing in, perhaps not sitting and staring, but maybe we are side to side together, watching something. Maybe we are walking together with a horse. You know, maybe the client is again mounted on the horse, we're on the ground. Maybe this is the one time that a particular client can engage in some caregiving behaviors because it feels safer. This is not another human who you're checking, checking on or giving some more hay or something like that. It's another animal that the power difference makes it feel a little more comfortable to kind of tap into a more empathic kind of caregiving orientation. There are a number of these elements that then the therapist can make use of, again, to enhance the way that they are trained to work and with the populations that they have had some guidance in working with.
There is so much in there. I had a million questions and they're slowly leaving. So I'm like, okay, which one's the most important? Let's grab them before they disappear. There's a few really cool things that you mentioned, and things that resonate with me, and you can clarify if they're accurate or add to it. One is, you know, personally, and with some of my students, I find that you mentioned curiosity, hope, and kind of state of being earlier, and I certainly find that easier to manage when I'm with my horses. They add to all of those components, and then in addition to that, you had mentioned kind of how, you know, even the change in environment can be really powerful for people. I can imagine with someone who, say, has anxiety, and as you mentioned, you know, eye contact might be intimidating for them, or being one-on-one with a person might be anxiety inducing. Having the distraction of a horse, having something else to look at, and that environmental change could be so powerful. It even brought to mind for me working with clients' horses, you know, and you know, I have a horse who, in fact, I'm working with a horse right now who went through some, you know, we'll label it, we went through some trauma, but working through those issues in a different environment is a huge piece of changing that horse's behavior. So it's like there's so many cool things to think about there. Would you say that those are some of the pieces that you talked about that kind of along the right lines? You know?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, I'm all about, because I work training also other therapists, I'm all about concepts and categories and trying to kind of deconstruct, like, what is it we're talking about, so that then we can engage with it, you know, more deeply perhaps. So really, you could say that there's three sort of main areas. or a reason perhaps why you might want to include equine interactions into therapy using therapy words. So I'm not using horse words here, although we can talk about what about horses perhaps may be, particularly engaging for folks. But using therapy-related human health and change words, they would be motivation for treatment, being able to stay with the therapy work. We know the more you stay in therapy, the more likely you are to have good therapeutic outcomes. There's a typical connection between those two things. So if we can make what can be a difficult process but shouldn't be super painful, then something is, perhaps your therapist isn't kind of pushing the brakes enough, or perhaps there's a mismatch. It shouldn't hurt badly to be in therapy. It shouldn't be worse than the actual experiences that you are in coming for help for. But motivation in general, that would be one reason. This idea that, hey, I do kind of want to come out here. I have a horse or two that I do want to meet in addition to my therapist, that kind of thing. The second area, which again speaks to several of the things that you talked about, Emma, is engagement in one's own treatment. And it's so important to think about therapist positioning, especially when we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about trauma and stress, the experiences that so many have, where, again, the full frontal gaze, while it can be attuning to softly look into another person's eyes. We've even had some human dog studies about that kind of frontal gaze, especially since dogs' eyes are more closely together than horses, and they tend to be looking more relative to any other species actually at our eyes. But you have to, in order to get there, to be able to look softly and receive the soft gaze of another, that's not a given, but that is kind of what therapy is. Sit down therapy nowadays is built on, because it used to be that traditional lay on a couch, the therapist is somewhere else, and you're free associating in the birth of psychotherapy. It's quite interesting shifts here, but that's exactly it, Emma. The ability for the client to engage in their own treatment and to feel that they have the ability to make modifications, that the therapist also feels that they can be more flexible with the use of space. And we have some more options we have an arena, no pun intended, a bigger space to engage with in the treatment. And then finally, if we're talking about these kind of big ways to categorize things: motivation, engagement in one's own treatment, so motivation to come to treatment and remain in treatment, engagement in it, and the therapist's ability to perhaps again introduce some additional experiential or tangible doing ways during therapy practice, as well as additional relationships, as well as more ways to move and be with one's body that the inclusion of horse interactions might make a little less awkward, because there's plenty of body-based psychotherapists who, move with their clients in a office space. But for many, that does not sound appealing at all, or it sounds awkward, or it sounds like it's not functional, or it's like fakey, pretendy. We can have the horse interaction as a bridge too for the therapist being able to use their tools, really more in an enhanced way, ideally.
Awesome.
Do you find that the majority of clients who are drawn to this type of psychotherapy are already equestrians, or is it kind of a blend?
Yeah, it depends. And it's important, again, to remember that the service is psychotherapy and the treatment is, say, cognitive processing therapy or EMDR, or I'm mentioning theoretical approaches that a therapist might take, and there's a number of them that you can get trained in. So it can either be that the therapist might already be including horses and suggest, hey, what do you think about, us meeting at this farm setting, or maybe that therapist's clinical practice is located in a place where there's an indoor office and the horses are right there, you know, or there could be two different spaces. So it could be the therapist introducing this, and it's really important to listen for client interest, because the client preference for doing this should really drive. It's almost a contraindication, meaning doing more harm than good if the client has no interest in interacting with, say, horses or other animals in their treatment. Then let's not do it. Because since it's not its own treatment intervention or treatment theory or strategy, then you can go about your work still without that extra enhancement, without those elements. If the client says, this is not really working, I'd rather just sit down inside, it helps me, ... But in a lot of cases, and of course we're talking about a range of potential clients from young children to older folks here, and people in different settings like residential treatment or hospital settings or something like that, you know, there are folks who say, hey, I really haven't had such good experiences just sitting down inside. You know, I've seen many therapists, just the thought of this is making my skin crawl, and they want to be able to have a different kind of experience while they're receiving treatment. And also, again, part of treatment, but it is not the treatment to interact with horses or be on the horse's back or the horse themselves even.
You're obviously passionate about this, and I mean, it goes to show that you've got passion for it if you lead a postmaster program. So where did this passion come from for you, and what I mean, you've just mentioned a whole bunch of things that add value to having, you know, horses used in trauma treatment, right? But what are some of those pieces that you really believe in and like? What's made you love this so much that you've pursued it in a kind of a higher education format?
Right. Well, again, personally, you know, I'd grown up with horses. I'd worked in the horse industry professionally. I'd been a competitive rider as well while I was still living in Europe. And I knew that I loved horses and animals. I loved people too. And I wasn't necessarily interested in a career focused on horse competition or, you know, kind of in that realm. So when I was of age to start university, I studied psychology, clinical psychology. And it was about halfway through my graduate program where I was like, oh, that's right. You could, you know, combine the two, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be the mounted work, the movement of the horse, which is more typical, or it's a way that, say, a physical or occupational therapist uses the neuromotor inputs from the horse's movement to, you know, work on the systems that they work on in the body. And a mental health provider may include some movement, but it's not the point to move and manipulate the horse's movement to give input to the human body, you know, in the way that those professions might work. So it really was more of a result, as I think it is for a lot of therapists who find themselves wanting to include horses, that they've had some experiences themselves, typically in a non-therapy setting, but nowadays psychotherapy with inclusion of horses is becoming more common. So people are actually having their own treatment experiences too, you know, say when they're younger, and then deciding, oh, I think I want to go ahead and become a therapist, you know, so that could be something as well. But for me, the experiences that I'm sure that we share here around caretaking horses, being with horses, interacting with horses as a very integrated part of one's life. You know, I think about what are then the elements that could be carried over into what's a more shorter period of time of interaction, like, again, a treatment setting. So I was very interested in this and the mechanisms relative to this, also quite early in my career as a therapist. So that's where I got started. And then you mentioned too, trauma, which is close to my heart, and would be happy to chat here about trauma treatment and the specific inclusion of equine interactions in trauma treatment as well.
Yes, please, go for it. Tell us what that is.
Sure. And as you both mentioned in the beginning, we did a previous podcast where we talked quite a bit about what trauma is, and how trauma is expressed in humans and in other animals, and ways that we diagnose trauma and all of that. And there's plenty of info just to find on the internet as well, if you're interested just in the what is this about, and why do humans have trauma? And it's an evolutionarily adaptive response that sort of at some point gets disrupted because of a number of individual factors relative to the person and their life, and relative to the specific events that are happening, and other things. So that's my 3-second summary of trauma itself, because focusing then on treating trauma, because trauma is a typical human evolutionary experience. It's not that humans haven't experienced trauma, it's just that we haven't conceptualized it as something that we can address in a healthcare setting. And it really started more with around really organized large world wars, where folks started to see that the occupational setting was perhaps causing a lot of physical and mental damage to folks in that occupational setting. And then eventually, not actually too long ago, like the 80s, the 90s, we started thinking formally about trauma and trauma treatment in the context of what we think about as modern healthcare. There was mentions in the 1800s as well relative to other wars and traumas and other psychiatric institutions, but I'm kind of bringing us to the 90s as the first tangible place where we also had the inclusion of a trauma diagnoses in our diagnostic and statistical manual that therapists use to help them diagnose, the first mention of that. So when we come to then today, and we know the disruptive effects of trauma, it's biopsychosocial, it has to do with your whole body and nervous system. It's your brain actually that affects how you can use your mind. And there are changes to how your brain functions after traumatic experiences, and changes to how your body engages. So when it comes to trauma treatment, the first line treatment is psychotherapy. So it's not just give somebody some psychopharmaca and leave them be, Psychopharmaca can be used concurrently. So we're talking like things like Prozac, Zoloft, other Paxil, other SSRIs and SNRIs. These are, for those who are interested, you might know what it is. It has to do with the serotonin inhibition and uptake in your brain. These particular kinds of medicines, which we can also use, by the way, in horses and other animals, which I think I'd mentioned earlier. But the point is that psychotherapy is truly the first line of treatment. And that means that folks then can address trauma through really knowing how is trauma expressing itself, learning-wise, attention, arousal and vigilance, mood, and a kind of intrusiveness. And how do we then address this? And excitingly, to me, the fact that we have the option to include interactions with horses in this service really can enhance it. And just to give you a kind of another one of those high-level conceptual categories of how to think about trauma treatment, because there's a number of treatments that focus specifically on traumatic memories and are called trauma treatments. But most of them still follow a basic framework that was proposed and then modified in the 90s by one of the forerunners, Judith Herman, who really helped drive this idea forward that this is not just for military veterans, this is actually also something that we can treat in psychotherapy. And there's basically 3 main phases or stages or areas. There's stabilization, and a sense of safety. So trying to help the person regulate in the absence of, anything emergent or immediate, helping them guide their own minds and giving them some psychoeducational tools. So in this category, we can do things like comparative health, knowing ourselves through also knowing that other mammals, speaking of our previous topic, have these experiences, and people might have even seen them in their own dogs and cats. We might have the calming effect of a calming other mammal present while the client is practicing regulating, guiding their own mind, for instance. And we can really engage the body along with the kind of the thoughts up there when we have a horse present. Because the use of yoga and other slow movement and stretching approaches has really been beneficial, proven beneficial in the context of people whose bodies have started to function a bit differently due to what the brain is interpreting as what should happen due to the trauma that could have happened years ago or could have happened cumulatively for 10 years straight in a relationship or environment. So we have these, so that area of simply seeking safety, regulating, can be amplified if we have the right conditions, such as a healthy, calm, content horse that the client can be with and near. There's two others. I'll just mention them briefly because I'm sure that there's questions that come up here. So one area of treatment is stabilization, regulation, kind of starting to know that the things that are happening in your body are actually not you're not losing your mind, so to speak, even if it feels that way, that your body was trying to protect or adapt to a particular situation. The other phase has to do with something called memory reconsolidation or updating, within which the traumatic memory is worked with in particular ways, whether it's through associations like the emotional valence or the quality of the memory, being able to bring fragments of experiences that just feel like they happened in another universe almost together into your coherent kind of mental narrative of your life. And this is the kind of area that sometimes can feel scary for folks who have had trauma to think about. And it's, again, not supposed to hurt badly to do this in a professional setting. And the final area, it has to do with connection to self. So being able to anchor oneself into a present, a past, a future, which we know through brain scanning, those processes function differently in the traumatized brain. No wonder it feels like, I can't really remember who I was. I don't know who I am now, and I can't even see who I could be in the future. And that kind of area, the connection or reconnection, also has to do with meeting and being with others, tolerating the exchange with others, as well as one's big context, one's community, one interacting with systems and structures that could actually be traumatizing, speaking of what's going on in our society, and just in general. And in each of these three broad areas that trauma treatment methods and models sort of follow in certain ways, you could start seeing, maybe even as I'm speaking, how the interaction with a horse might support or enhance or make activities or happenings in these areas more tolerable, more engaging, more soothing, more effective perhaps. But we have to start having some good quality research to make those statements, but the intention would be more effective.
It's funny, that's exactly as you were talking, I was picturing it all. And, definitely around the sense of felt safety and that regulation. Like, I'm sure all of us can, really relate to the day that we come home from work and it's been a little stressful and we walk into our paddock and it's just like, ah, and it just, you just feel that, that calm start to happen. When it comes to starting to work with those memories and those pieces, what can that look like? Is that, the same as what you were describing before, just kind of that side to side, and just kind of bringing the horse into that piece? Or, yeah, I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit more.
Sure. That kind of second area that I touched upon really, again, can bring a lot of concern to folks who have experienced trauma. It's like, well, I've decided I'm never going to think about that again. No matter how many nightmares I have at night or random sensations or smells I'm getting during my day that makes me think I've completely lost my mind, but I'm never going to think about that. But then we know as trauma therapists, in most cases, if we're talking about direct trauma treatment, then there is some aspect of updating or addressing those traumatic memories, kind of allowing them to have a timestamp so that it doesn't keep feeling like we're reliving them. We can just maybe mentally revisit them and know that they happened in our lives. But we don't have to feel all the feelings of terror and overwhelm every time we get reminded of it. And in that particular phase, what the therapist really is doing is helping the client approach or modulate when they again, mentally, it's tricky because it's technically stuff that's invisible, like you approaching your own thoughts. It sounds like a very abstract, strange thing if we explained it to, say, an alien of some sort. So we could create these, making the intangible more tangible. We could bring into the arena, again, literal and figurative in the horse setting, an opportunity for the client to kind of maybe physically take one more step forward, have the horse right there as they're approaching their own memories, and knowing that they can stop, knowing that they have a touch point, like a physical connection to the here and now. So through the ability to touch and be near the large body of the horse, which again wouldn't be necessarily appropriate for me as a therapist for the client to lay their hands on my body to know that I'm there, but I might engage them verbally or in other ways to allow them to have what we call a dual perspective or dual attention, so that they're able to approach their memory, but they have anchoring through the warm, real horse, who is definitely not, like the therapist, engaging in an attuned trauma thing, might be having a little grass or just doing things that are calm and typical that can really help the client, again, anchor in that particular process of relating to the memory, which different trauma treatment techniques have various ways that this happens. It can be through a pendulation, it can be through other desensitization approaches, which are similar or the same as we might use as equine behaviors, professionals, when we are trying to lessen the intensity of something that can truly become neutral for somebody. But for that particular, activity within a specific trauma treatment approach, in my experience, it's been the anchoring through the real liveness of the horse and the being with in the horse environment, the equine environment, that can help that process not feel a little more connected to the present for the client, so they don't feel they're going to get sucked into the warp of a trauma memory, which, if folks are listening, I've certainly had those experiences myself. It does feel like you're leaving where you were, and it can feel very scary.
Mm-hmm. That's such, it's so powerful, Nina. I'm like, oh man, I want to go and try this now. And you're talking a lot about what the benefits are to the patient, to the person receiving the therapy. And I'm curious about the skill set that the therapist needs to have, because obviously there's those basic horse handling skills, but is there anything specific or a few specific things that that a therapist needs to know that's different than if they were in an in-office setting? with their clients?
Sure, sure. And here's where, when we're talking about healthcare, we have, already practice standards. We have a set of things we need to do. We need to also look for whether our professional therapy associations have put out any competencies, which is the case here in the United States, around what you need to know in order to include animals in treatment. What kind of additional knowledge, skills, and attitudes or values that should guide your work there. So we need to keep an eye on, those things kind of also formally, so that we're working within the regulations that we have, and not just, I can do this because I have horse experience, because we're working within a profession, so we have to relate to that profession. Now, when we're thinking about horses and psychotherapy, I think the easiest way I can explain this is that when we bring then a client to us, or client comes to us, we basically have a therapeutic environment, whether it's a tangible nature environment or an office, but we have sort of an environment that we are responsible for as the therapist, to make sure that that environment is not harmful and that it has healthy relationships, at least from the human professional side. Like, I'm responsible for myself and for managing that environment, for reducing risk to the client physically and emotionally, and increasing comfort to the client physically and emotionally in my therapeutic environment. So when we're including a horse, which technically belong to a vulnerable population, because they're another species, they have less power, they have less say. Humans choose to listen or not to what horses say, and they ask horses to suppress experiences and expressions to serve human utilization. So when you're then, as me, as a, working in the horse industry, as well as a therapist, I keep my therapist hat on when I'm thinking about the horse in the therapy session. I'm thinking about, yes, and of course I would like everybody to have a figurative therapist hat on when they're thinking about horses, because it's that kind of attending to, caring about the other as an individual, as opposed to what can you do for me? I don't think of my clients as, how much money can you pay me this session? Thinking about them and their experience, while I also have role power. So when we're including the horse, the relationships with the horse, the experience of the horse has to be aligned with your therapeutic environment, because otherwise you're potentially opening up for horses having very intense stress responses, or the sense that the horse is being exploited, they can stand there, the horse is standing tied up in the sun, and while we're sitting here talking, that's fine, they're just a horse. But go over here now and relate to them like you would to a human. There's these strange unintended consequences that folks might run into when they're not trained in the merging of the two, and they might be carrying some horse perspectives from the larger horse industry that are not aligned or conducive with a treatment environment in psychotherapy. So, I recently heard about a situation which is quite common, where somebody says, well, I use my horse as a barometer. If they pin their ears and run away, then the client's angry, or something like that. And I'm thinking about that as, I wonder about the therapeutic environment that allows for members of that environment to reach such a level of stress and discomfort, within the treatment environment. Because of course, that can happen with the client. It can happen accidentally with a horse. We need to repair that. But to kind of have that as a feature that, we'll just let the horse kick out, and to tell the client that wasn't appropriate. That to me ruptures the idea of the treatment environment and sort of brings in elements that I can't have as a therapist. So there's a lot of ethical considerations of power differences, of relational dynamics, and some very strange unintended consequences by well-meaning folks when they are including horses in treatment. There's quite a lot of nuances.
Mm. There's just so much. It feels like there's just all these different layers that you'd be considering that when you're bringing a horse in, or bringing a client into the arena, like you say. Um, are there particular horses that serve better, for lack of a better term, as being part of such a process? Or is there anything specifically that a therapist would be looking for in a horse that they would be wanting to include?
Sure. Again, kind of if you keep that idea in mind that the therapist and the client really is co-creating the therapeutic environment, and the horse and whoever else is there, but you as the therapist, you're in charge of making sure that what's happening is appropriate, and you can make modifications per your profession. If you think about then that when we're including other animals especially, but also generally, that we want to mitigate risk, emotional and physical. We want to increase comfort when possible. Of course, if we're working in trauma treatment, there will be some uncomfortable moments. It's not that they won't happen, but it's my responsibility to mitigate them so they don't become unbearable. But we can use those same principles when we're thinking of, well, what horses could I include then? Should they have specific training or not? And I think about, first of all, preparing for work role, like we would in any setting, that if I'm expecting a horse to stand and tied with a halter on by a tying post, that horse is prepared and knows what that is, and that they know that I'm not pushing that horse beyond their capacity to stand still, for instance. Or if they are supposed to be interacted with directly with a client, touching, grooming, leading, that the horse has those. It's not that the horse thinks, oh, I'm a therapy horse now I'm going to do these other things that I haven't ever learned how to do. Even if it's compelling to think that way, even if sometimes there's some strange moment that we see where a horse does something that we didn't think they would in a good way, but our mind likes to make meaning of it, and the closest meaning is, oh, they know they're our therapy horse, and of course, versus something else, right? So knowing what you're asking of horses. Some people never have equipment on their horses in therapy. Some people have a saddle and like a full range of things. So knowing that those things should be the same, you should know what you're expecting so the horse is prepared for that. And then secondly, looking at that individual horse and thinking, how well am I able to mitigate any risk to this horse, physically and emotionally, for being part of this session, and can I increase comfort for this horse? So if we have a horse who's had a lot of disruptive, scary experiences in their lives, and we are having new people interact with them in our therapy sessions throughout the week, that might not be that the horse's experience needs to sometime, then your consideration for them override this idea that, oh, traumatized horse, traumatized person, cool, they can just treat each other, which of course, no, that does not work that way, and you have to be careful about your professional responsibilities. But I always look at, how much risk can I mitigate here? How predictable is this horse in their experiences with their individual variation and their background? And how comfortable would this horse potentially be? Like my Mini does not like to be touched. Would I bring her in just because she's small to be touched? No, she doesn't like to be touched. Another horse of mine is like, okay, I could scratch me, that's cool. Or they've been, exposed to human touching so much that they're like, okay, it's pretty neutral to me at this point. I kind of just stand here, So those, so instead of thinking, oh, this particular breed or this age, even though age does play in terms of emotional maturity and things like that, it's more about, I think, more about those guidelines, risk, emotional and mental, as well as how much comfort could this horse potentially experience. Because I'm not using the horse to get at the client, if that makes sense. That wouldn't work for my therapeutic environment. It wouldn't feel okay from a treatment perspective.
I would love to hear a little bit about what makes or what a client, let's say someone tries, you know, some trauma treatment with their therapist and a horse. What can that client look for in themselves to tell them whether or not the session has been going well for them and that this method has been good for them?
Sure. And again, you know, it's important to note that the service is psychotherapy, the treatment approach or method is whatever the human thing is, and the inclusion of horses is not its own method. But I understand what you're saying, Emma, in terms of like assessing, like, do I want to work with my therapist outside or not?
Mm-hmm.
And I, you know, for instance, like this is me getting to this treatment or clinic location feasible for me in the long run? Am I feeling like me and my therapist, because it is the primary relationship in the treatment, even though the relationship with the horse can bring so many unexpected and you know, beneficial things to the client's life, the main relationship is still with human to human. So if the client is feeling that my therapist and I don't seem to always see eye to eye, or I feel sometimes that they don't understand me, or I feel sometimes that I'm not listened to in my needs in this treatment, and if the therapist says, well, you know, being with horses is so good, I really think we should continue, and you as the client saying, well, but maybe sometimes I feel like I just want to talk to you, that's okay too. You know, and if your therapist isn't responding to you, then you might ask to be referred to somebody else. And if you as the client feel at times that you feel a natural kind of nervousness, perhaps being next to a large horse, but you feel like you can't really talk about that, or it feels like that's a given that you should now like horses, I suggest talking to your therapist about it. And if you don't get a response, perhaps thinking about that it's more about another therapist versus the elements of equine interaction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good answer.
This is kind of slightly towards left field, but I'm curious, when you first started integrating horses as part of what you were doing as a psychotherapist, were there any moments that really stood out for you that surprised you?
As I think many have experienced, including myself, is the sometimes rapid, the kind of, it sometimes feels like the client experience becomes accelerated almost. And that's not always a good thing. It's something that we need to watch for. We perhaps there's some therapy approaches that still think this way, but not so much in trauma treatment in particular, where it's kind of like, yes, the client cried. Yes, you know, now we're getting catharsis or something like that, which again could have been more a thing of the past perhaps, or in certain very controlled ways of doing things, but not how I would like to work. So noticing that the combination of experiential engagement, which there's a whole area of experiential therapy where therapists make use of how humans learn and then reflect on their experiences in therapy without animals too. But I think it's the combination of the doing. There's a doing in space. There's not just reflecting back at things, but there's active things happening, even in just the stroking of the horse's coat. You know, doesn't have to be this, you know, very detailed, which some practitioners do very well, metaphorical landscape where this bucket represents your mother and that thing represents your house, and how do you feel now that you're approaching, and then the horse has a certain metaphoric role. Those things can all, that's also a way to work. There's no set way to include horse interactions, you know, how it might look. It's depending on what you're trained in as a therapist without horses that you can really kind of navigate that. But I think the combination of experiential, the combination of touch, being able to touch or feel somebody else, the combination of being in a non-traditional, perhaps treatment environment, outside, moving around, there's sandy arena, there's trees, there's grass, other animals, By the way, it's gotten very dark here because we have a thunder and lightning storm happening, and I am nowhere near any overhead lights. So I am kind of
No
coming to you
problem.
from the shade, and it's starting to thunder outside. That's why the light changed so severely. But
it's like you've got a sepia tone filter on. It's kind of romantic looking.
Oh, sweet. That's
Yeah.
great. I'm trying to shift a little, but it's not picking up any additional light here. But yeah, so I think the rapid experiences that clients might feel like they can disclose things, or things come up quite intensely, which again can be good, but it can also be something that a therapist really, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know when to help apply the brake together with the client. And I've also seen in some ways, in some instances, when having a client mounted on the horse, so we don't talk about riding because the service isn't riding, it's psychotherapy. So we talk about, if we have a client placed on the horse, in some ways, they're sitting like you would when you're sitting on a horse typically, or they might be sitting sideways or in any other position, that the combination of being elevated from the ground, little bit of tension, their body position can cause a body or position related recall of trauma that they weren't expecting. So that's why it's not just put the client with the horse and cool, it's really almost, you have more opportunities, but you also have more responsibilities to the horse and to the client. So that more rapid approaching of clients' topics, as well as them connecting with you as the therapist too, can be good, or it can be less beneficial overall. So those are things that I definitely noticed early on.
And for some people who maybe haven't had trauma treatment, so could you just speak to, and you alluded to it a little bit there, you talked about it a little bit, but the importance of not pushing too hard too fast, and what the kind of the dangers of that could be.
Yes, if you're a person participating in treatment or thinking about participating in treatment, I really want you to know that it shouldn't hurt more to be in treatment than, again, the trauma that you've had or the discomfort and suffering you might feel in your day-to-day life. It is the therapist's responsibility to help you with this. And if it feels too overwhelming for you to, they should notice, but you could also let them know that it's going too fast, so to speak. But when we're, in trauma treatment in general, the therapist should be trained specifically in trauma treatment, and then know about this. Again, what I mentioned, the old triphasic framework, where you have work in all those three broad areas needing to happen. And before you as a therapist go and approach any traumatic memories, making sure that the client has some guiding capacities in themselves to stop thoughts emerging. We're giving some very tangible core mind skill tools that everybody can benefit from, such as observing your thoughts and emotions without feeling kind of sucked into them. Like sometimes they can be over there, like a little river floating by, and I can be over here as the observing mind, relative to these things, and think, oh, that's a very strange thing to think. I guess I'm thinking it, that it's you can be curious about it. And so and then there's other mind skills too, like putting a lid on things for a little while to take it out again, putting things in a box containing things, knowing when your body's starting to tell you that, ooh, I'm getting to the point where I'm not feeling good, and being able to take some action in your day-to-day life to mitigate that. Because once we start approaching traumatic memories, it's kind of like your whole system starts to reorganizing again, and it can feel a little unexpected, especially when most folks don't have that one car accident one time and that was it in terms of any overwhelming things in their lives. All of us have had times in our youth and in our adult lives that have stuck with us, and that have kind of kept rippling a little bit in terms of the feeling about it. It's not just a memory, it's kind of a ripple in you. So yeah, a trauma therapist knows how to help their client, what we call resource, around some tools and skills, which are not unlike, but in a horse context, what we might introduce to a horse who struggled with overwhelming experiences, and the kind of resourcing we can give to them in the interactions with us. It has to do with the body. It's not so much about these advanced abstract thoughts, that kind of thing. I hope that answers your question, Emma.
Yes, it does. It's like, I mean, whether we're working on horse behavior or learning to play the guitar or in trauma treatment, there's those base foundation pieces that you can't jump ahead of, or that's when you run into trouble. Does that sound kind of right?
Yes, and those base foundation pieces, we're not done with them. They're not just done and packed away, and we everything we're doing in say, as the example is trauma treatment, is cyclical, and we come back to various kind of areas of treatment because we are complex human beings, and horses are complex social mammals. So it's interesting for those who are therapists and who do equine behavior to see those comparative parallels and especially in trauma treatment, where we're really working with the body, the autonomic nervous system, a person's relationship with themselves that has been damaged through the ways that your brain has just tried to help you out. And those words to me are directly also applicable to horses.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we could just keep going and going and going, but we had set the intention of just keeping it to an hour when we started in today, and I'm mindful of time. Nina, that was wonderful. I once again, I feel like we could be here for hours, and I could just keep listening and asking questions. You just have such a wealth of knowledge.
I think that whether you want to or not, Nina, you are now a regular guest of ours. Because as Mira said so beautifully, you're just a wealth of knowledge, and all of those pieces. I mean, you covered beautifully a whole bunch of pieces there that I'm sure each little chunk could be an entire episode. It was fantastic. So thank you. Is there anything that we didn't touch on before we go that you feel is important to get out there?
I think that there's a lot of interest now in the inclusion of animals in psychotherapy services. There's a lot of folks who really want to get going on this. And my best advice is to, again, make sure that the service that you're trained for, the service you're given, as a healthcare provider, as an educator, as a coach, as a facilitator, whatever area we're talking about here, and that the inclusion of horses in that area is not the be-all end-all of the service. It's meant to engage, motivate, enhance, and in certain non-healthcare, non-treatment approaches, it really can become its own goal. It's a mix of horsemanship and personal development, and it can be that. But when you're looking for a professional who has a particular title and restriction and is supposed to help you, specifically with your health and that kind of thing, that it's important that we really think about our professional integrity and identity, that we dedicate ourselves to really understanding the experiences of horses, not as just an appendix that can assess clients for us or something like that, which, as compelling as it is, it's not actually what's happening from an equine behavior, an equine kind of cognitive point of view. And that's why it's important that we bring in knowledge from a wealth of fields here. And finally, for those who are already doing this, asking yourselves, is your therapeutic environment are the interactions with horses that are happening aligned with your therapeutic environment and your goals? And are horses at times put in such compromising situations just to serve the client? And if so, it might go against the kind of system, because we're part of a system when we're in therapy, that you might want to make use of to facilitate health and healing.
I love that. Welfare for our animals and our humans.
Yes, yes, exactly right.
Okay, well, yes, that was a pleasure. And I think, shall we wrap it up? Is that a wrap, Mira?
I think that's a wrap.
If you want more Friends on Horses, you can find us on Facebook at Friends on Horses Podcast.
Check it out for all the latest and greatest horsey news.
You can find us on the web at friendsonhorsespodcast.com
or Instagram at friendsonhorses_podcast.
Like what you hear? Help us quit our hay jobs by supporting Friends on Horses. You can support us by rating our episodes on iTunes,
becoming an ongoing sponsor through Patreon,
or simply by spreading the word about our show.
Have some feedback?
We'd love to hear from you.
Contact us via email at friendsonhorses@gmail.com.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.